Have it your way.
Supernatural has come to an end. While the last episode was interesting and somewhat disappointing, we're going to ignore that. Instead, we're going to focus on the most interesting aspect about Supernatural's last season, which was its main villain, God himself. Ever since the end of the 14th season, I was excited by the idea that Supernatural's last villain would be none other than Chuck. With the Winchester brothers having killed or interacted with basically every other supernatural creature known to man, it felt right for the last villain to be the strongest creature of them all. After all, what being could be stronger than the one that created everything? But it is not Chuck's power that I found interesting. The character, as expected, was omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient, with very minor limitations imposed by the show. Instead, we're going to be looking at Chuck's personality, as well as the implications of having God as a final villain. You see, Supernatural refused to treat God any differently than the show treated its other characters. Instead of the mysterious, perfect being depicted in religious texts, God received the same treatment received by the angels, demons, and other monsters in the show. God was not just God, he was Chuck. He wasn't just the creator of everything, he was a layered and complex character. He had a history and a personality with regrets, ambitions, and goals driving his every action. Most importantly, Chuck had flaws, the kind of flaws that only come with being the single strongest being in existence. He was narcissistic, controlling, and unapologetic. Whenever the beings he had allowed to exist rebelled or displeased him, he would remove them from existence. Whenever he got bored with one world, he would abandon it and create another. It's the presence of these flaws that make Chuck such an interesting character and final villain. While we would rush to judge and demonize Chuck for his actions, a closer look might reveal that our instincts are wrong. Perhaps, despite God's actions and personality framing him as the antagonist of our story, the reality is that he's not a villain at all. To find out more about God's character and the ways in which Supernatural redefined him, we will break Chuck's presence in the show in 3 stages. First, we will look at Chuck Shurley, the means by which God inserted himself into his favorite story and interacted with the characters he had created. Second, we will look at God's benevolent persona, all the way from his conversation with Metatron until Jack's murder. This is going to be regarded as God's fake persona, given Chuck's real nature and influence upon Sam and Dean's lives had not yet been revealed. Finally, we will look at God's real persona, that is to say, God as a bored writer. At this stage, we're going to reveal who God really is, looking at his character from the finale of season 14 until the end of the show itself. I think that by the end of the video, you will agree with me that God, or Chuck, could never be the villain in Supernatural's story. Let me explain.
I am so sorry. I mean, horror is one thing, but to be forced to live bad writing. If I would have known it was real, I would have done another pass.
By looking at the character that God used to insert himself into the story, 4 of Chuck's personality traits are revealed. Chuck is narcissistic, immersive, deceitful, and mischievous. When it comes to God's narcissism, we will group this with him being self-centered and self-gratifying. This means that Chuck only really cares about himself and his desires, perceiving the world as the tool that revolves around him and is meant to please him. While Chuck loved the supernatural story that he had created, he couldn't help but eventually insert himself into that story. He took on the role of Chuck Shurley, a writer who had been publishing books about Sam and Dean's real-life experiences without being aware of his prophetic abilities. He gave himself a character arc, going from a regular writer to a prophet of the Lord, gaining the opportunity to help the characters he had been writing about. Going from religious figure to popular writer, Chuck traded his religious followers for fans of his book. He traded religious places of worship for conventions and fan clubs. Even as his character, Chuck couldn't help but want to be loved and adored, going so far as romantically pursuing fans of his books and commenting on theater renditions of Supernatural. Even when Chuck wasn't physically present, he managed to introduce himself into the story. Take Season 5's finale, for example, where Chuck acted as the narrator of the story, telling the audience about the history and significance of the Impala. Also, the titles of his chapters were the titles of the show's episodes, ensuring his continuous presence on his favorite show. Given how dedicated God is to putting himself in Chuck's shoes, we can see that he's also a fan of being immersed. For as long as God pretends to be Chuck Shurley, he never breaks character. After all, Chuck is a vulnerable, anxious, and depressed writer, and God allows himself to be immersed into that role. He gives Sam helpful advice and allows Dean and Zachariah to threaten him. He even allows Metatron to insult his books. Meanwhile, Chuck does nothing in return, refusing to break character and use his godly powers. God also appears to be incredibly deceitful. At every single stage of his Chuck Shurley persona, God is never honest. First, he pretends to be a writer that needs to be convinced that his stories are real. Then, he needs to be convinced that he is a prophet, not just a writer with psychic abilities. During this entire process, God is never truthful about his identity and role in Supernatural's story. Finally, God is also incredibly mischievous and playful, going far beyond his deceitful nature. Just like any other writer, Chuck loves foreshadowing, literary symmetry, and dropping hints about the truth. As soon as Chuck's self-inserted character is forced to face the truth about his abilities, he says,
Obviously, I'm a god.
You're not a god.
How else do you explain it? I write things and then they come to life? Yeah, no, I'm definitely a god. A cruel, capricious god.
While Sam and Dean refuse to believe that Chuck could be God, or that he could have willingly caused them so much pain and suffering, we now know that to be true. We now know that as the author of their lives, God caused all of the pain suffered by Sam and Dean, shrouding his admission of guilt behind the veil of his fake character. However, Chuck also gives more subtle clues about his real identity. For example, when Chuck is talking to Metatron in one of his safe houses, he's seen drinking out of a cup that says "World's Greatest Dad," hinting at his real identity. As we can see, Chuck is narcissistic, immersive, deceitful, and mischievous. But let's take a look at Chuck's fake persona and see what other personality traits are revealed by this stage. By looking at God's journey from his reveal to Metatron until his murder of Jack, 3 more personality traits become obvious. Chuck is proud, manipulative, and malicious. Chuck's pride can be broken down into his inability to admit his own mistakes and his desire to be above everything else. When Amara confronts Chuck about his creation, telling him that he only created archangels and humans so that he may be above everything else, Chuck admits this to be true. While he does add that he didn't want to be alone, he still admits that he created lesser beings, whose existence and worship made him feel big. This feeling of being bigger than anything else is the reason why Chuck is unable to admit his own mistakes or be challenged by lesser beings. When Metatron questions his bravery, Chuck lashes out and sends him flying. When Lucifer demands an apology for the way he was treated, Chuck can barely muster a non-apology. This is a fake form of apology that either places the blame on the person that was offended or that serves to excuse the offender by providing an explanation.
I am sorry that you feel that I betrayed you, that I acted without cause. I'm sorry that you can't see you gave me no choice.
There he goes.
I did what I had to do. To create the world, I had to lock Amara away. And when the Mark corrupted you, and I saw that you posed a threat to humankind, I did the same with you.
No, you betrayed me.
This brings us to Chuck's manipulative nature. When Chuck realizes that the non-apology is not going to work with Lucifer, he simply opts to become a better liar, telling Lucifer everything he wanted to hear. However, Lucifer is not the only one that is manipulated by Chuck. Sam and Dean are also the recipients of Chuck's manipulation. In order to buy their trust and compassion, Chuck uses Kevin as a token of his benevolence, sending him to heaven. This benevolent and altruistic act gains the trust of the Winchester brothers, making them vulnerable to Chuck's manipulation. After all, Chuck is a master at making malicious acts appear benevolent. Every time he gets questioned as to why he abandoned Earth, God says that he didn't want to be an overbearing parent, allowing his creation to thrive without him. Except for one time when he gets questioned by Metatron. During this one interaction, Chuck admits that the real reason he left creation was because it disappointed him. In reality, Chuck saw humanity and creation itself as yet another failed experiment, ready to be discarded. As a minor additional point, Chuck's mastery over language and manipulation bleeds into all of his interactions. When being questioned by Sam as to his creation and abandonment of other worlds, Chuck turns every question and situation back on Sam, not once providing an answer.
So Michael said that you create these worlds and you just toss them away, like failed versions of some book.
And you believe him?
Was he lying? Is that what you're doing to us?
No, Sam.
Finally, Chuck is also incredibly malicious. Disappointed with his creation, Chuck is content with Amara destroying the universe as long as he survives. He doesn't show any care for humanity, choosing to save Sam and Dean from the darkness while letting entire other cities perish at the hands of his sister. Chuck reacts aggressively to being challenged as well. When Metatron hurts his feelings, Chuck destroys his sense of self-worth by telling Metatron that he is not special. The only reason he chose him as his scribe was because of Metatron's proximity to the door. But Chuck's malice transcends inaction or hurtful words. Chuck is a cruel god that cares very little for the lives of those he interacts with. Remember when we said that God sent Kevin to heaven in order to buy the compassion of the Winchesters? Well, it is later revealed that God had in fact sent Kevin to hell, despite the reality that the location of Kevin's soul had no bearing upon him. However, the most incriminating piece of evidence for God's malice is his murder of Jack. Despite the two being related, and there being no real reason to kill Jack other than to satisfy Chuck's literary desires, Chuck lazily opts to kill Jack in front of his loved ones. As we can see, Chuck is also proud, manipulative, and malicious. Now it's time to look at the character's final stage and see what other personality traits are revealed. As soon as Chuck kills Jack and reveals to the Winchesters that he has been taking control of their entire lives, we finally see who God really is. All of Chuck's previous traits are emphasized tenfold. Chuck is narcissistic and proud, wanting to feel big and important. This is why he goes to Becky when he needs to feel better about himself and regain his purpose. He uses a devout follower to boost himself up. Chuck is also manipulative, malicious, and deceitful. As soon as people have served their purpose, he simply erases them from existence. He actively takes control of people's bodies and even gives Sam fake visions in order to guide the story in the direction he wants it to go. Most importantly, it becomes obvious that Chuck is obsessed with control. When the story does not go according to plan, Chuck attempts to force it in its intended direction, killing Jack when Dean refuses to. Once his protagonists start rebelling against him, Chuck pretends to have relinquished control over their lives. Having been wounded by Sam, Chuck is scared as to what might happen, probably for the very first time. Feeling lost and hopeless for a short period of time, Chuck resorts to one of his most devout followers, interacting with Becky until he regains a sense of purpose and control. He starts to write the Winchester story once more, giving it a biblical ending. When the ending he wrote for the characters does not come to pass, and Chuck realizes that he has completely lost control over his characters and the course of their narrative, he attempts to change the story. Trying to regain control, Chuck shifts the story from one of familial murder to one of eternal loneliness and suffering. However, Chuck is not satisfied with this new story, saying it gets boring quite quickly. Despite this argument, the truth is that Chuck could have never been satisfied with any other story, as he would have been forced into those stories by his very own characters. In a final attempt at regaining control over his creation, Chuck tries to erase it, doing it with his own two hands in order to gain a tangible sense of control. Ironically, Chuck's attempts at gaining control made him lose all semblance of it. Had he never inserted himself into the story, made himself the final villain, or blatantly controlled the lives of the Winchesters, he would have never lost the sense of control that he needed to exist. The punishment Chuck received was poetic. The all-powerful, self-centered, manipulative being was reduced to being just the same as his creations. Chuck had lost all sense of power and control, unable to twist the fate of any other creature.
And I think it's the ending where you're just like us. Unlike all the other humans you forgot about.
It's the ending where you grow old, you get sick, and you just die.
And no one cares. And no one remembers you. You're just forgotten.
As we can see, Chuck is not a benevolent character. He's manipulative, malicious, and vindictive. He's self-absorbed and controlling. He is the villain of our story. But what if he isn't? Chuck is not just Chuck or God, but he's a creator. He's the writer of the entire supernatural universe and its stories. He's not different from any other author who writes a book set in a universe that is populated with characters. While Chuck does get a chance to interact with his characters and insert himself into his books, they are still just characters to him. Now, imagine that those very same characters rebelled. Imagine that the words Chuck put on paper were constantly changed and altered by the sheer will of his creations. Imagine that the words you wrote down every day were changed by characters you had created from your imagination and creativity. In such a context, Chuck's malice and lack of self-control is completely understandable, given he is just a writer forced to confront his fictional characters. For Chuck, the only real creatures in existence are him and his sister. Every other creation is nothing more than fiction. Finally, can we blame Chuck for putting the Winchesters through so much anguish when his writing has led to a show with 15 seasons? Every story needs conflict and loss. Every story needs joy and happiness. Every story needs heroes and villains. That is exactly what Chuck gave us. Can we really vilify an author for giving us a story that we enjoyed, even if this joy came from conflict that harmed our main characters? I don't think we can. Chuck may have a lot of personality flaws, and he may have painted himself as the villain of the story, but I think all of that is irrelevant. I think Chuck is the author of the supernatural story, not its villain. But let me know what you think in the comments section below. Do you agree with our analysis of Chuck? Also, do you think that we can vilify the writer of a tragic yet good story when we ourselves enjoyed watching it? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you for watching. Keep writing. Hey, you made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you know. If you are interested in supporting the channel in any other way, we also have a Patreon. For the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can support the content we create and even be included in our videos. It's pretty cool, so give it a look.